Welcome everyone to our webinar today, which is top tips for designing and delivering great presentations. We're going to spend the majority of the time focused on presentation figures, but we're also going to cover some of the less thought of aspects of presentations as well. Again, if you are interested in signing up for a BioRender account, you can follow the link that's on the screen there. It'll take you to this sign up page where you can create your BioRender account and log in and follow along with the content that we're covering today. And before we jump into things here, just a couple of housekeeping items for everyone. First, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A section of the Zoom window. It just helps us stay organized and is make sure that we're able to get to your questions. If there's a lot of activity in the chat, sometimes your question can get buried, and we just want to make sure that we're able to address all the questions that you do have. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Kat and Val, who will be keeping an eye out on the chat. And they'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you have. And we don't have a dedicated Q&A, so at any point, if you do have any questions during this time, feel free to just ask into the Q&A window. We want to make sure that you're getting the most from this time. So if there's anything that's unclear, anything that you want to learn more about, just let us know, and we're happy to dive into it deeper with you. And then you can use the chat in the Zoom to say hi to your colleagues. I see a lot of activity in there already. People getting to know each other and sharing what they use what they're using BioRender for. So please definitely encourage like the interaction and the engagement, and looking forward to the questions and thoughts that you have to share. For those of you who are brand new to BioRender, it's a communications tool that was developed because our co-founder, Shizai Oki, who's with us today, realized during her time as a medical illustrator at National Geographic that many scientists and labs don't really have the budget or resources to visually translate their science. And this was the spark that drove the founding of BioRender, to give everyone the tools and the practical knowledge to visually communicate their research and allow everyone to clearly convey their message visually. So you can see an example of some BioRender images on the screen right here. And here are just some of the common ways that we see BioRender being used to give everyone some ideas. For those of you who are power users or veterans of the platform, you probably already know this, but you can use it to create figures across your entire scientific journey, starting all the way from the ideation and brainstorming phases, all the way up to your publications, to your patents, your posters, and even more in the future. And of course, for today, our focus will be on presentations. So let's get started here. As scientists, I'm sure everyone knows presenting our work is an important part of what we do, whether we're presenting to our own team, to other departments at conferences, or presenting, project progress to leadership. It's a critical part in making sure our work is understood, to make sure that we're making well-informed decisions regarding the direction we're taking our research in. And the challenge is that the people that we present to, they often have far too much to do and far too little time to do it in. So we have a limited amount of time to make sure that they clearly understand our key message. And thinking for yourself too, like to the people that you present, oftentimes we need to make sure that our key message is abundantly clear so that people don't get distracted. And that's what the tips we're going to cover today will address, how we can get our message across efficiently during our presentations and our meetings. And to help us do that, today is broken up roughly into 3 parts. We'll do a quick review of hardware, and then we're going to look at design tips for your entire slide deck, and then focusing on design tips for our slide figures specifically. And again, at any point, if you do have questions, feel free to ask. We're happy to dive into it deeper with you. All right, so let's dive in here with a quick review of hardware tips that we can use to engage our audience. And I think with many of us meeting regularly over Zoom and presenting virtually like we are now, we don't always stop to think about the equipment that we're using to present. And the main thing that I want to talk about here is about audio quality, specifically from your audience's point of view, because it can really make or break your presentation. And here's sort of a rough ranking of audio quality for different types of microphones, starting from, earpods, uh, our laptop microphones, gaming headsets, standalone microphones, as well as teleconferencing headsets as well. And what might be surprising are the gaming headsets. They sort of sit in the middle of the spectrum. And the reason for that is while gaming headsets are designed to deliver really great sound, so you can hear all the little details in your game, the wind rustling, the music, footsteps, they're not always designed to have the best microphone quality. So it's just something to be aware of. And it's similar for AirPods or similar headphones as well. Often these are optimized to give you really good sound, but they're not necessarily optimized for microphone quality. And to just highlight the impact and the difference that different devices can have, I actually want to do a quick test with everyone here. So right now I'm using a headset, but what I'm going to do is actually just switch over to my laptop microphone. I'm just going to make that switch here. And maybe you can hear that difference right away. It's echoey, it's a bit more distant. I'm already in a room that has carpet, so that helps a little bit. But if you imagine if you're in an office that has concrete walls, bare floors, that sound is going to be much bouncier. And yeah, you can hear that difference right away. And as a listening experience, this can be quite challenging for someone to have to listen to this for an extended period of time, and it can detract from what you're trying to say. And to switch back over to my headset now, hopefully you can hear that difference. The sound is a bit more lush there. I sound closer to you, partly because physically the microphone's closer to my mouth. And I'm not advocating for any specific brands. You're really just looking for a microphone that's designed for teleconferencing and something that's close to your mouth, again, to help reduce like that sort of echoey effect that you get. And again, with so many presentations being virtual here, audio quality just becomes so important, especially as you need to present for longer. Just imagine having to listen to my laptop microphone, or if I have something like AirPods, for example, it would be a much more difficult listening experience because you are almost fighting to understand or trying to tease out the words that I'm actually using. And really the message that I want everyone to take home here from this part is to just test out your audio quality, whether it's asking a friend or a colleague to test your audio, or even just recording yourself speaking with different microphones and playing back for yourself to see what it sounds like. It can give you a very good idea of what your audience's listening experience is going to be. As well, don't be afraid to tell your colleagues if their sound is not great, because it really does take away from the message that they're trying to deliver. As an extreme example, if you imagine when someone has like a choppy internet connection, or if there's a lot of static, you're not actually listening to the ideas and message that they're trying to send. You're actually just you're fighting to understand each word that they're saying. And that just detracts from that overall message that I think that's the intent, sorry, of the communication. Awesome. So now that we've gone over that review of hardware, we're going to jump right into this next category here, which is design tips for overall slide decks. And I think it's difficult to give tips here because every presentation's a little bit different. The length of your talk is going to be different. The content that you're presenting will change. So instead of talking about what you should do for your presentations and your slide decks, I think it actually might be more helpful instead to talk about all the things that you should be avoiding, regardless of the deck that you're creating and regardless of the meeting that you're preparing for. So I have it on the slide here, basically everything all at once of things that we shouldn't do. So one of the first things that we want to avoid doing is avoiding gradient backgrounds. And the reason for this is that it's twofold. One, it's difficult to do tastefully. It can make your deck look a little bit more dated, but it also creates inconsistent legibility. And I have some examples later of why this can this is impactful, probably because you have like this changing background color. We also want to avoid things like drop shadows because it's distracting for your viewers. Reading this line, likely you're also looking at underneath and just examining the shadows, which again just moves the focus of your audience away from your message towards things that are irrelevant to that discussion. You also want to avoid using harsh colors like this bright yellow font that we're using above for this title slide, because very bright, very strong colored elements really pull your attention towards it. And again, when we hop into the platform, I have examples of where this can actually be very impactful as well. Again, another point that we want to avoid is using decorative bullet points, going back to where our focus is. When you have very ornate bullet points, it sort of takes away and draws your audience's attention to it. So sticking with something more of like a standard bullet point or a dash can go a long way to just keeping your audience more focused. And lastly, we just want to avoid serif fonts. These are all the fonts that have that little flourish at the end. Things like Times New Roman, for example, that's a serif font as well. And then we want to instead focus on using sans serif font like Arial, Calibri. These come off cleaner when you present your slides. And even just comparing, this slide here to the previous slide that we're looking at, right away you can see like the difference between the two to just give you an idea of how far creating clear slides can make your content just become more approachable and easier to engage with. All right. So now that we've sort of covered the peripherals of creating and preparing our presentations, let's actually dive into the meat of the content today, which is design tips specifically for the figures that we're creating for our presentations. Because I think there are some slight differences compared to when we're designing it for our publications or otherwise. There are things that we should be keeping in mind when we're presenting. Whoops. Let's hop into BioRender here and just kind of walk through a lot of these tips with everyone. And there's a lot of different things that we should keep in mind, right? Like I said, a lot of what when we're presenting to people, these are people that are doing way too much with way too little time. And what we want to do is make sure that our figures are effective at communicating our key ideas to our audience. And there's a handful of things I want to talk about today. One is about contrast and accessibility. We're going to talk about legibility, how we can use color as well. And also we're going to look at what the impact of alignment and spacing is. And we're going to have different before and after examples with all these tips to show you how big of a change it can, the change that it can create when you're just applying these little things. And so these are all very readily accessible tips that I think everyone can apply into their figures. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is contrast and accessibility. And I have this before example here with our two different cells. So one thing that you always want to keep in mind, and I think we do this a little bit already, is to make sure that everything on your page is actually legible. And one thing to keep in mind is that when you're presenting virtually, your monitor will very likely look different from your audience's monitor because it's a different brand, different technology. As well, if you're presenting on a projector, that's going to look a little bit different as well. So it's important to consider how your audience might actually receive your figure. And so here in this example, you can see that we have some challenges already, right? We have some labels that sort of blend into our background a little bit for both our T cell and our macrophage. And one thing that I wanted to highlight here, we talked about why we should avoid gradient backgrounds. And I think this is a really good example of it. What you can see here is that we have our text box, and it actually crosses different colors. We have one color for our nucleus, one color for our cytoplasm, and we also have another color for our nuclear membrane. And what it does is it creates that inconsistent legibility because our font is generally going to be a consistent color. When it needs to cross different color boundaries, it's going to be a little bit more legible in some spots and less in others. And it creates this inconsistent experience for your audience. And one way that we can check for our check to see our contrast and legibility is actually counterintuitively to strip all of the color away from our figure. And we can do that by going over here to this navigational toolbar. We have this option here to view canvas in grayscale. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And this removes all of the color from our figure. And when this happens, you'll see that certain things are blending into each other, right? Like our DNA sort of just disappears into our nucleus. The cell label becomes even more difficult to read. And when we see these things happen, it's our cue to go back in and make sure that we have appropriate contrast between all of our elements. And some simple fixes could even just be to, move our labels out. And this is really easy because, within the platform, we can make edits to our illustrations really quickly. And one thing that we're able to do, we saw that the DNA disappeared, is make it stand out more from our background. And so one way to do this is just make it really dark. So if we do that, and again, we go ahead and strip the color, you'll see that the DNA now stands out in much sharper contrast compared to the background that it's sitting on. And if we just wave a magic wand here and just fully transform this illustration, you'll see that right away, this becomes much more legible, especially compared to our previous illustration, where we have things that are a little bit more faded. We're going to have this much brighter and more accessible illustration to use in our presentation. And to just highlight some of the changes that we made, we didn't really change the composition at all, right? What we did was we made the cell a little bit lighter, and then we made the DNA darker, which then increases the difference in color value between our foreground and background. What we also did was change our bacteria color, again, just making sure that it stands out more against the background that it's sitting in. And also something to help as well with our text, we brought it out of the cell just so that it has a consistent color background that it's sitting on, so you don't have those inconsistencies in legibility. And to just add, again, one more example to this, you see some cells in a test tube here. Same thing. When we have our color stripped away, you can see that this fades in a bit more, whereas when we have like that darker color in the front, this becomes much more legible. So we always want to just double check our figures, make sure that they are easy to read, because then the audience doesn't have to fight to get into your figure. And the next thing that I want to talk about here is how we can actually use contrast to help us tell our story. So previously, that was more of like a practical application of contrast to make sure that things are legible. But we can also use contrast in a way that helps us to focus on the key elements within our story. So here we have a before example of the 4 stages of lung cancer. You can see here that the main characters are likely the tumor as well as the lymph nodes. And then the lungs, these are actually just what help us set the stage for our story. But right now, because our lungs are so opaque, what happens is that it takes away from our main characters a little bit. These are not as big of a star of the show as they could be. And so this is where we can use contrast to help us. What we can do is actually change the background, the transparency of our illustration here, and have that fade in a little bit. So you're still able to see the context of where the story is taking place. But now, instead of stealing the show, it allows us to focus more on the tumor and the lymph nodes. And you can see that it actually pops into view quite a bit better. And I'm going to just return the slide to as is because I want to highlight that difference, that before and after. So once we apply that transformation and just make all of the lungs a little bit more transparent, you can see that it starts to highlight that tumor. And this is one simple change. We just increase the transparency of the lungs so that they are still there. We're still able to see it. We know the context of the story, but now we're focused more on the tumor and the lymph nodes. And if we hop back and forth between these two figures, you can see that now the tumors stand out quite a bit more in relation to our figure. And so just highlighting this is that before, and now this is that after. And so we have all of those same components. It's just a little change in the composition and how we want to represent what's happening in the background compared to what's happening in the foreground. So kind of cool way to, add focus and spotlight to your for your audience so they can they know where they should be looking. And I'm seeing a lot of activity in the chat and the Q&A. This is fantastic. Please keep the questions coming. We really do appreciate the engagement. It helps us. It helps me at least see that people are sort of letting these tips percolate and then getting ideas on how they can implement them into their own figures. And I think I saw a question actually that came in talking about font size and what the minimum font size is that they should be using for their illustrations. And I think this is a nice sort of segue into that as well, like what we should be considering when we deal with our text. One thing that I thought was actually really interesting was that when we talk about font sizes, it's not actually the magnitude of the font size that's important. It's actually the ratio of the font against the size of your canvas. And to give you an example here, you can see that this is a font size of 8. And if we go to present, it's not the smallest font size. If you think about it, this is much larger for a size 8 font than we would expect because this is it's traditionally considered very, very small, but this is still decently legible. We can still make improvements here, but it's not the absolute worst, not as bad as we would have expected. However, as just to highlight this, if we were, let's say, working on a much bigger surface, and we can actually change the canvas size to highlight this, is if we need to adjust it, we make this really big now. Make this a bit bigger, and then apply that. When we go back into present, all of a sudden, that same font size 8 text looks actually much smaller than it was previously. And that's because now in relation to the rest of your page, it's going to be much smaller. And so it's not the absolute size you should be concerned about. It's more the ratio of the font size against your canvas. I'm just going to reverse that here so it's a little bit smaller again. But right away here, you can see that with our illustration, we can be more clear with our font size. We don't want our audience struggling to read what's on our page. And I think that's something that is we start to neglect a little bit because we're presenting virtually so much that everyone has their own screen. If they had to, they can sort of lean closer to the monitor to see what's on there. But it becomes much more difficult when you're presenting in larger conference rooms because at some point you can only lean so far. So what we want to do is just make sure that all of our font sizes and everything is appropriate and everything is legible. And so one thing we can do is just simply make this larger, right? We have a font size of 7. If we needed to, we can just bring up that the size of this, and then we can fix that as well to make sure everything is clear. And a tip that was given to me before is when you're preparing for a presentation, it's always helpful to just go in there, beforehand, put your slides up on the projector and then sit in the back of the room just to make sure that when you're there, you can still read everything that's on the page, because once the person in the very back can read it, that means everyone else in the room can also see. And what we can do here is just something that I wanted to highlight, and I think that might be kind of interesting for everyone. As I talked about, font sizes and what we should be doing, I would like to imagine that at least some of you were looking at these labels up top, and then we're really focused and wondering why those were falling out of line, right? Like these are all kind of misaligned, and maybe at least for some of you, you would wish that you could reach in across the screen and then just move them a little bit just so that they are locked into place with everything else. And I wanted to leave this here to highlight why the little details that can really detract and take away from your presentation. As we talked about font sizes and all that, your focus was actually up top here on these titles. And this just goes to show that the little details in your illustration can have very big impact on your presentation as a whole. So to make sure that our audience is focused only on what we want them to, we want to make sure that our illustrations are crisp and neatly lined up. And if I just wave a magic wand here, again, we're going to fix all of those little changes. And what we did here was really just change that font size, change the alignment. And if we go back to our previous figure, and I'm going to remove that line there because it's a little bit distracting. When we compare these two, you can see that right away, this before, it's just a little bit messier. Things are a little bit out of order, and it's not as easy or clean to look at. Whereas this, everything is very crisp. We have even spacing everywhere. Our titles are lined up. So if you were distracted before, this should help mitigate that. And it's just the takeaway here from this tip is to pay attention to those little details because they can have they can really distract. Sorry, that's the word I'm trying to use. Distract from the message that you're trying to communicate. And going back to font size as well, you can see that we increase it from size 8 to size 11, where again, not actually that big of a change. But when we go to present, that key thing here is to make sure that it's an appropriate ratio between our font size and our overall canvas. And you can see this is much clearer for us to look at. All right, now the next tip here that I want to chat about is step-by-step figures. And what I mean by this here is how we can break apart more complex ideas into their individual pieces so that our audience can more easily follow along with your content. And I have an example here to share with everyone, this insulin pathway. And before we even get into that, sorry, this is a little bit distracting here. So I'm just going to crop this out so that you're also focused on what I want to talk about and not wondering why there is a big ball that is just sort of sticking off the edge here. So I'm just going to quickly crop this. Whoops, let me just grab this as well. I'm going to edit the crop. And then I'm just going to tuck this in just so that we are all focused on my main message and not on the extraneous parts of this this figure as well. All right, so we're no stranger to figures like this, right? If you imagine any presentation, any seminar that you've been to, most of the time, if not always, before the presenter dives into their own research, they'll likely have a figure like this up, either showing a pathway or a mechanism. And I don't know about all of you, but for myself, what I found was that these slides were very overwhelming, especially if I wasn't intimately familiar with the content, because as they're talking, what I'm trying to do is decipher this this illustration at the same time. I'm trying to understand, okay, which protein refers to where, what's the pathway, and it becomes a much more difficult experience for me to actually follow along and understand, what the presenter is actually trying to say. So instead, what we want to do is actually break this up into smaller pieces. And one way that we can do that is just make a few copies of this illustration here and have those pieces come into place one at a time. So what I'll do here is just duplicate this a couple times to kind of highlight this. And just once more. And what we want to do is have this figure come together step by step. And what we'll do is actually start from the back. So this is our final figure that we want to use. So in the previous figure, I actually want to hide step 4. I just want to be focused on step 3 so we can remove all of that. And then in our second figure, we just remove step 4 and then we remove step 3. So now our audience is focused on step 2. And then finally, in our first figure, we want to remove all of that and they're just looking at that binding step. So we're going to remove all that there. And so when we go to present, what it looks like is we begin our presentation, we give that background. This is the overview of our mechanism. And then when we go to talk about step 1, that binding, we just have that on the screen here. And so people are focused on that. And then when we talk about the signal cascade, we bring that in. Then we talk about exocytosis. And then finally, we talk about glucose entry. And so this is a step-by-step way of walking through our illustration. I think a lot of us do this already in the slides that we create. So this is one way of looking at it. The other way, actually, and maybe this is something that you might not have tried before, is actually use a spotlight effect. I think this is actually really cool. I used to have things come together or like come in pieces. But another way, just to give you some ideas, is making things transparent. And same thing, this comes together in 3 steps. So I'm just going to come make copies of this and one more. And instead of having each piece this time come together one at a time, what I'll do is have everything on my slide here. But what I'll do is when I'm talking about ligand binding, I can actually make this less of a focus. So just like how we were playing with transparency to highlight to highlight our tumor and the main characters of our story, we can do the same thing here. We're going to increase that transparency to make sure that the section or the chapter that we're focused on is much more apparent than the others. And we can do the same thing here. So in step 2, we're going to talk about that cytosolic phase. So in step 1, this is going to be a little bit more transparent. Same with this one here. This is also going to go fade into transparency. And then lastly, in this last piece, we're going to do the same thing. I want to show you that final effect. So when we go and we talk about the different phases of ligand binding leading to transcription, we can start here. This is the full overview. And then when we talk about ligand binding, we can fade everything else into the background. Now our audience knows this is what we need to be focused on. And then when we talk about the cytosolic phase, we move that spotlight into the middle here. And then finally, we bring it to the very end when we talk about that nuclear phase. And so this can help keep everything in context while simultaneously allowing our reader and our audience to know where they should be focused on. And so this is just a gentler way of just guiding your audience across your figure. So just an alternative to having things come together piece by piece. All right. Thanks for the reactions there. I'm glad to hear that these are helpful for folks, and it's giving people ideas on how they can bring these tips into their own figures. So the next thing that I want to talk about here is crop and callouts. And what I mean by that is how we can actually zoom in on smaller aspects of our figure without compromising the entire thing. So I have a couple examples to show. And this is the final product that we would get to, but I want to highlight how we get there. So I'm just going to remove this first. And so let's say that on our slide, we have like this tumor on our brain, and we want to draw some attention to the tumor. One thing that we could do is maybe click on this and then make this extremely big so that we can see all the details of the tumor and maybe the other regions of the brain. But this is not very practical, right? There's only going to be so much real estate you have on your slide, and having your brain take up 90% of this entire slide just to focus on this little 10% is not the most effective use, and it raises questions about the clear. It'll make your slide less clear and look very cluttered. Instead, what we can do is actually zoom in to the brain. And what we're going to do here is we're going to first make a duplicate of this, and this might seem like I'm contradicting myself, but we're going to first make this really big. And hear me out. What I'll do afterwards is then crop this image. Now, the cool thing is within BioRender, all of these images that you see, these are all vector-based images, so we can actually make them really big without losing any of that detail or that resolution, sorry, so we can really see those fine details. And this is really helpful for when we need to zoom into something. We can make it really big first, and then after, we're just going to crop this. And this time I'm going to use a circle crop just because I like using like more of like a magnifying glass effect, but you can use different shapes as well. I just use a circle, but we can make this a little bit smaller first. And then we're going to move it on top of our tumor. So this is the region that we actually want to focus on. And when we click out of the crop, you can see we trim everything away. And now we have much more detail into the tumor, and it takes up relatively less size than if we were to just make this super large. And so we can do this and call this out here. And then we can connect our original in context element to our callout by maybe using something like a zoom callout or a magnifying glass to create that effect. So I'm just going to use a zoom callout here. And maybe I want to use this one. And I can bring it out. We're going to rotate that into position. so that we can just kind of place things into position here. And for those of you who are, BioRender users, you've recognized that this is a grouped icon. What this means, I can click into it, and now I can adjust the components inside. So for me, I want to make sure that this circle actually encompasses my entire brain. So I'm going to go ahead and just, whoops, I'm going to hold Shift to lock that into a circle. So we're just going to make this bigger so that it sort of covers my entire callout. I'm going to move this into position. There's a little bit that's still sticking out, so I'm just going to make this a wee bit bigger. Perfect. And then we're going to align these lines as well. So we're just going to grab the end here. We're just going to attach it to, or just have it touch the sides like that. And then when I click away, you can actually see we're able to call that focus. We keep everything in context, and then we're able to call out that tumor. So we can see those details. And same thing, just to really drive this point home, it's same if we have, let's say, the stereotax, etc., this imaging setup where we want to zoom in quite a bit more. Same thing, we can first make that first image really, really big. And then from here, we're just cropping it. So if we want to focus in on the mouse's head or just at the point between the machine and our mouse, we're just going to crop it. Same thing, going to apply that circle crop. Zoom it down a little bit. So we're just focused on this portion here. We can get even more specific as well if we wanted to. So if we really wanted to just have that point of interaction, we just cut out everything that we don't want, click out. And then now, once we have this, we can make this even larger. So it's just easier for us to just sort of work with. And again, because it is a vector-based illustration, you can see that we don't lose any of that detail surrounding of our mouse as well. We can really zoom into it. And finally, just to, and just to sort of bring this all together now, we're just going to grab one more zoom call out, bring it out onto our page just to really drive that point home. This is something that I find is pretty fun. It's just highlight where we want that to go. Again, go in here, we make this call out larger, and then we can relate the two illustrations back to each other like so. And so I think it's just an effective way of utilizing the space that we have on our slides without compromising any of the clarity of our illustration. So we can just move that into position again. We can fine tune it a little bit more. And then we can just talk a lot of this, again, just details. You don't want to have little things kind of falling over your page because then it just makes it a little distracting. And then we just fix up those lines as well. And just to highlight what is very possible within the platform, that there's a lot of customization that we can do to help us create clear illustrations for our figures. And so hopefully this has given people, good ideas on how they can improve the clarity of the figures that they're presenting or planning on presenting in all of your different meetings. And I think a nice segue here, I'm actually going to turn it over to Shiz now, who's going to walk you through, again, our PowerPoint integration. It's super exciting. We're very excited to share this, everyone. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn it over to Shiz here, and she'll take us through this new feature.
Thanks so much, Tim. And is my audio coming in okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Can all hear me? Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Great tips. And thanks everybody for all the great engagement. If you have any questions, please continue to ask them in the Q&A. We'll also stick around. I know this is only set for, I think, 45 minutes, but we'll stick around till about, 10 to maybe even 5 minutes to the hour. If you have any questions, happy to stay back. Um, I'm starting out with, on the topic of presentations, all too familiar PowerPoint. So if you can see my screen, you can see that I've opened up PowerPoint. I'm using Microsoft in Apple. So I'm on a MacBook. It might look a little different if you're on a PC. But what's really exciting is that we've now built an integration from BioRender directly into PowerPoint. I've had a lot of requests for this, probably one of the most requested features in the history of BioRender's existence. It is still in beta. There's a lot more we want to add to it, and we're really, really open to hearing feedback on how it works. But let me just real quick walk you through how it actually works. So um, I've got my, almost perfect PowerPoint slide here. I'm getting ready for my meeting to report up to my directors. If you're working in industry, maybe for my PIs or during our lab meeting or departmental meeting. And what you probably typically did was go into BioRender, export your image, and then suit it for, let's see, usually we do 150 DPI for images. That tends to be enough for PowerPoint. If you do 300, it's kind of overkill, I find. Um, so what you do is, export that, download the JPEG to your computer, go to PowerPoint, insert that into your deck, and then if you want to make changes, you have to do that whole process over and over again. So to avoid that, what we've done now is you can actually just directly import your figure into the slide itself. So let's see here. Let's find an open slide that I'd probably add it to. Let's use this one. So what you would do, a lot of you probably will be the first time ever in inputting or downloading this integration, but what you would normally do is go to your home insert option here. If you can see my mouse, there's this button here called Get Add-ins, and it'll take you to the Microsoft App Store. Probably going to be your first time ever seeing this website, which is fine. It was actually my first time too. I don't think all of us regularly download PowerPoint integrations, but we've got your first go at it, which will be BioRender, hopefully. So you've got BioRender for PowerPoint. Click Get It Now. It'll sort of walk you through the steps. You might have to sign into Google if you have like something special set up, or sign into your actual Microsoft account. But I'll skip all those steps. Assume you went through a little bit of the process of getting this inputted. And then once you've got your plugin downloaded and you navigate back to PowerPoint, it should show up in um, this little menu here when you click Get Add-in. And it should probably show up here as well. If you see the BioRender logo in the top right, think of it as your trusty, BioRender helper now that you can now add your figures in there. So let's try it out. Click the BioRender button. And I'm actually already logged in, but I'm going to log out just to show you what it might look like when you first come across this plugin. So you'll see BioRender. It almost looks like the sign-in page, but squished onto the right side of your PowerPoint app. I'm going to type in my login here, biorender.com. And actually, because it's kind of meta, but BioRender as an institution, say BioRender, swap it out with Harvard or Pfizer, your institution might have single sign-on or that special portal login. It'll detect that. And I'm going to use that to log in because it actually makes it easier. I don't have to remember my password and all of that. And there we go. And really only one prompt. Not too many bells and whistles as of yet, but we're trying to keep it simple and easy. Add a file. And what you're noticing is I actually have my BioRender gallery within the PowerPoint pop-up here. So if I were to kind of switch over to BioRender really quick, you'll see that it actually mirrors my gallery page. So this is my BioRender gallery. Everything here is now available here within the PowerPoint sort of pop-up. I happen to know that the figure that I want has something to do with the Warburg effect. So I can search by name, or it'll probably be one of the last files that I worked on. So I can click it as well. So I'm going to find it there. Once you click it, actually, if you go back, some of my files are BioRender slides. Some of you have been using slides for a while within BioRender. Slides is kind of a misnomer. I kind of use slides as a multi-canvas. But in any case, I clicked it, and so it's now giving me another option to say, okay, well, which of those slides within BioRender did you want to import? I'm going to click this one. Also, you'll see how bad I am at naming my files. And so that's something I encourage you all to maybe do some housekeeping on if you don't already. I'm sure we all have untitled version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It'll just make it easier if you name it, I don't know, October 25th, presentation to embed or something like that. But anyways, add to slide. And voila. Now, say my background was, I don't know, something special like, let's see, like a soft gray or something like that for some reason, although we discourage background colors, but say it is, for example, I've got this sort of white box effect happening. And gonna remove the title. There we go, maybe a little more realistic. Say I want to remove the white background. Again, what I would have normally had to do is go back to BioRender and remove the background as a PNG, export it, and then import it back in. I can actually go directly into BioRender here and click the snazzy little slider button. So remove the background or put it back in. You can actually just do it right from the PowerPoint integration. Now, PowerPoint does this kind of annoying thing where it's now telling me, hey, you can add all these fancy finishings to this slide. Kind of ignore that. Nothing to do with BioRender, I promise. It's this like special designer pop-up that shows up. Oh, it disappeared. Okay. Oh, I think I accidentally accepted one of their weird design tips. Let me undo that. Okay, there we go. I don't know if you saw that, but just try to ignore some of the fancy bells and whistles that PowerPoint will prompt you to do. If you don't like that, transparent background, you can bring it back to white. I'd probably recommend just keeping a background white anyway, but there's never you never know. You might want to have something show up in the background, or if you're kind of layering different images. I really like that really quick PNG option. Now, speaking of presentations, Tim gave some really good tips about making sure your font is at a minimum size. If I'm presenting this in a big conference hall, those little tiny glucose 6P labels are going to definitely disappear. So I'm going to go back to BioRender and make an edit. And one hot tip, you don't have to actually click Shift, click, 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 click to do, to increase the font size for everything. Very unknown feature is to be able to select all text at once, and that's here in the dropdown. I'm going to go to Edit, select all text, and then increase the font size for everything. Great tip. Now, of course, everything is perfectly, laid out, and so now I have to go back and do just a little bit of, um, finessing, but that actually is, I think, less time spent than having to go back and, manually click everything. So love that little tip. Definitely, we should probably make it more obvious. I like having the title nice and big too. And then any spelling mistakes or anything? No, I think it looks good. So go ahead and you don't have to hit save because everything actually auto saves, but just for my own anxiety, I'm going to hit save and then move back to PowerPoint. And now it's not automatic because maybe you might not want it to automatically update. We give you that option. So I'm going to go ahead and click the figure again. And it says, hey, there's an update available. Either I made the update, or maybe if it's like a shared figure with my colleagues, they made an update and I get to now take advantage of that. Um, so let me see if I'm going to want to update that. Nice. Okay, so you saw the difference there, the before and after, much better. And I didn't have to go through the process of, exporting and re-adding to my slide. It's exactly where I placed it as well. So that's also a nice thing. And if you have a million files like me again, and you aren't good at labeling the name, you can actually just click this edit in BioRender button and it'll take you exactly to that figure. It'll hopefully drop me right back into BioRender's app. There we go. So super easy. It's just kind of a, cyclical function and really excited about this feature. Shout out to the developers that worked on this internally in the team, Mit, Sandeep, Polly, and Graydon, the whole growth team. Super excited that this is now launched. Again, it is still in beta. So what beta means, it's just, still a work in progress. So we'd love if you kind of gave feedback here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars, and elaborate on anything that you'd like to see added to this feature. We're constantly making improvements to the BioRender product as well. So would love your feedback. Um, let's see, anything else I wanted to touch on this? I think this is it. Hope you enjoyed this plugin. Let me go back to my app. I know we only got a few minutes left, so maybe I'll just wrap up here, Tim, if you want to chime in as well. But thank you all so much for the engagement and the excitement. I'm really excited that we can help you make better presentations going forward. Um, oh,
Awesome.
actually, I also have this pop-up. Tim, maybe I'll just show my screen. This is actually what you're going to see if you're interested to bring BioRender to your institution. Go to biorender.com/contact. You'll see this form, and this is where you can kind of fill out information, bring BioRender to your institution. Even better, oh wait, there's more. If you have the free BioRender tool, you should be able to see this pop up. If you go to your name and then look at the drop down there, it says Get BioRender Premium. There is a chance that your institution might already have access to BioRender. So this is a really good way to say, to check maybe it's University of Toronto, click, and then, search by department, biology, and then just go through the process and it'll check for you automatically to see if your institution already has access and you just didn't know it. It actually happens a lot. So go ahead and take a quick peek to see if your company or institution already has access. That way you can take advantage of all the really cool bells and whistles of our premium features. Awesome. Anything else to add, Tim, before we wrap up here?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. Hopefully everyone is really excited after seeing that PowerPoint integration here. I know that from the first poll that we launched earlier in the session that one of the big challenges was, context switching and switching between applications. So really excited for you to try this out to hopefully minimize the amount of going back and forth between different windows, that you now have a more streamlined way of preparing your presentations and all of the figures that go into it. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us, for all of your great engagement. Really appreciate all the supports of BioRender that you all show. Again, we launched one last poll here, just asking what your thoughts are on this session today to help us understand, what sort of content we should continue to provide for our audiences. And we're happy to stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any last questions. But if not, thank you again for joining us today, and hope to see you at a future webinar. Happy illustrating, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks again, Tim, as well. Great session. And thank you everybody that joined. Really great turnout and great engagement. Thanks so much. See you at the next one.